It is truly my privilege and pleasure to welcome back Professor Moghaddam to Stanford. We had the pleasure of having him here 3 years ago when his earlier book about dictatorship was just published. He now has a book about the psychology of democracy. He handles issues that are rather simple and complicated. I think in our times, with the rise of fundamentalism throughout the world, with the rise of despotism, with the resurgence of authoritarianism around the world, the notion that human beings, whether they have an innate tendency for democracy or that they have an innate tendency for despotism, is one of the most relevant and contemporary issues. Professor Moghaddam is a professor of psychology at Georgetown University. One of the events, I was just talking with him, one of the programs we have just launched on Iranian studies this year is a joint program with the medical school, with the lab in the medical school, with Professor Parvizi. And it basically tries to work on aspects of a program that Professor Moghaddam has launched at Georgetown. His program at Georgetown is an interdisciplinary program of cognitive science. Our program is an interdisciplinary approach to what neuroscience tells us about good and evil, about sources of morality and ethics. Professor Moghaddam is an impeccable scholar, and the depth of his knowledge and the depth of his scholarship, the depth of his work is only matched by his humility and his remarkable sense of discipline. Every time I have the pleasure and privilege of talking with him, I say to myself, why would it be wonderful if he wasn't at Stanford and I could enjoy this conversation around the clock. The weather is better than Georgetown, but I'm not sure we can provide all the amenities you have. So please join me in welcoming Professor Moghaddam.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and honor to be here, and particularly an honor to be introduced by Dr. Milani, who is really one of the leading scholars in the world on Iranian studies and has made this center a world leader. I wish we could take you to the East Coast. I always provide an outline for what I'm going to say. Please, if you don't have it, there are lots of copies. Could we have a handout? Thank you. So the handout is available, and it's important because I lose my way and I don't know what I'm saying. So at least when you have the handout, you know what I'm supposed to be saying. So I'm going to start off by talking about a puzzle. And the puzzle is a very important puzzle because it impacts all of us, and it concerns the puzzle of revolutions. And I faced this puzzle, as I think some of you did, in 1979. I was a student in England, and I rushed back to Iran. I still remember driving overland to Iran, and on the road, there were thousands of us, very excited about the revolution and the changes we were going to bring. I still remember how excited we were when we got to the border of Iran from Turkey. And we drove to Tehran, and it was the spring of revolution. If at that time you had told me that we would have a dictatorship so soon after the revolution, I would not have believed it. Because there was absolute freedom. Women were free to participate in politics. I started teaching at universities immediately. When they reopened, the first semester I was there, women were very active. There were many different groups on campuses. There were Trotskyites, there were Maoists, there were Islamic fundamentalists, and it seemed unbelievable that within a few years all of that would be wiped away. So that was a puzzle about Iran. But as I studied revolutions as a psychologist, I learned gradually that it was not just Iran. If we go back to the French Revolution, the Great Revolution, Napoleon became an emperor, and he established his family as kings and queens around Europe. Yes?
All of these three previous revolutions.
Can you ask the questions later? There is a question and answer break. I'm sorry, I apologize.
Okay. So the French Revolution did not end monarchy. The Russian Revolution of 1917, we got rid of the Tsar, and we ended up with Stalin. And now we have Putin. The Cuban Revolution didn't end dictatorship. We've had the Castro family ruling. The Arab Spring. The Arab Spring started with such great hope, and unfortunately, very quickly, we've ended up with dictatorships again. The only country that seems to be an exception is Tunisia, where there is some hope. So the puzzle is this. Why is it that revolutions against dictatorship so often end up with other dictatorships? Now, there are a few exceptions you could argue. For example, the American Revolution, you could argue, was an anti-dictatorship revolution. The revolution in South Africa didn't end with another dictatorship, we might argue. However, in those cases, the leaders were exceptional. Washington and Mandela were one of the few people in history who had absolute power and gave it up. And I'm going to come back to those cases. So the question is, why do revolutions fail? Why do anti-dictatorship movements fail? And I believe the answer comes back to not just institutions, not just constitutions, but it comes back to basic psychology, and particularly the psychology of groups and the psychology of individuals. And I'm starting with groups first, and that is not traditional, because in traditional Western psychology, at least, we focus on the individual. But for me, the collective has priority. So I'm going to come back to that theme of collective change. Why is it so difficult to achieve collective change? I'm going to begin with the assumption that all... Thank you. Thank you. All societies began as dictatorships. Some societies have made some progress towards what I call actualized democracy. Actualized democracy is an ideal. It's what we're shooting towards. Obviously, when we look at the present situation in the United States and Europe, and even Scandinavia, it's pretty obvious we do not have the ideal. We don't have the ideal candidates anyway. The key role played by psychology becomes more obvious when we think about the psychological traits that I'm going to talk about later. traits like tolerance for ambiguity. Tolerance for ambiguity. The ability to think with fuzzy categories. The ability to think outside the black and white system of I'm right, you're wrong. These I'm going to come back to later. Now I'm going to start though with a question. Is it the case that one person's dictatorship is another person's democracy? Do we actually have criteria to identify progress towards democracy? I would argue we do. Under number 4, I've listed some of the criteria that I think are important. One of them is the town square criteria. That is, can you go to your local town square and speak against the leadership and not be attacked, not be killed, not be jailed? Well, I know that there are parts of the world where I could not do that, including, unfortunately, Iran at the moment. Minority rights. A democracy must give importance to minority rights. We know that it's majority rule, but the majority rule must not violate the rights of minorities. And again, we know in many parts of the world the violation takes place. The vote them out test. A democracy must enable citizens to vote out the leaders. We can see in some countries they have elections, for example, in Russia. Increasingly, the same is true in Turkey, for example, where they have elections, but you cannot vote out the leader because the leader becomes the president, then the prime minister, then something else. And an independent judiciary. So I could go on with this list, but the key point is that we can objectively identify some criteria that tell us how much progress has been made towards actualized democracy. Now, this particular moment in time is important because the threat to democracy is increasing in so many ways. First of all, terrorism. Of course, the number of people killed by terrorists is very small. Around 20,000 people commit suicide each year. We don't have a war on suicide. Very few people are killed by terrorism. The danger from terrorism is not the number of people killed, it's that governments around the world are using security as an excuse to take away basic freedoms from people. So that is a grave danger to democracy at the moment. Another danger to democracy at the moment is the rising threat of major dictatorships, China and Russia. We mustn't forget that they are not just dictatorships for themselves, they are anti-democratic around the world. And minor dictatorships such as Iran and North Korea. Again, these are not just isolated states. These are states actively working against openness in other parts of the world. Another reason why democracy is under threat, under danger at the moment, is because there are a number of countries that 20 years ago were becoming more democratic, but now are going backwards towards dictatorship. These include Turkey, these include Venezuela, as well as a number of South American countries. Venezuela is a classic instance. I taught at Caracas University when Chavez was alive, and you could see the step-by-step movement away from the open society. He was clamping down and ending freedoms, and now we're in a situation where a country with such rich resources is economically stifled and politically corrupted. So democracy is under attack in this way as well, where there has been a slide backwards in a number of countries that were becoming democratic. Another issue that I think is important, and some might disagree with me, we can debate this. I believe that increasing inequalities and concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands, as demonstrated by recent research, for example, Thomas Piketty's book, the concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands is a danger to democracy, especially when you have in the United States the Supreme Court deciding that spending money in elections is equal to free speech. Recently, Oxfam announced that something like 80 people in the world have as much wealth as half the world's population. 80 people and 3.5 billion people. I believe that is a flaw, and that is something that impacts, weakens democracy. Another factor that very few people are attending to, but Gordon has written a brilliant book recently. His book is called The Rise and Fall of American Growth. And this factor is the leveling off and perhaps even decline of productivity. Very few people are attending to this. What's happened is that since the 1970s, productivity has stagnated and even perhaps declined. Now, this may seem very strange because all of us are running around saying we're working harder than ever. But actually, the statistics show that productivity has not risen since the 1970s. Facebook, Twitter, all these things, they have not increased productivity. Now, you take the trend of increasing wealth concentration in fewer and fewer hands and stagnating productivity, and the consequence for the bottom 40–50% is clear. The bottom 40–50% is being squeezed even more. I believe these are all trends that threaten democracy even more. Why? Because when you have people, the majority, who are getting deprived economically, under pressure, they cannot participate in the democratic process. It's no good saying, well, they all have a vote. They all have a vote, but participation in democracy is different. So that's the context we're dealing with. Let me now turn to another issue. The approach I'm taking is very different from traditional psychology. Traditional psychology, as I mentioned, focuses on individual processes. I believe the way to look at democracy and dictatorship, to understand it, is to look at collective processes first, and then individual processes. Traditional psychology has focused on the personality of leaders, personality of dictators. So we have thousands of studies on people like Hitler, Gaddafi, etc. I have argued that the way to understand dictatorship and the weakness of democracy is not to focus on individuals, but the context in which the dictatorship arises. I call this the springboard to dictatorship. A springboard is created. It enables the dictator to rise up and grab power. My argument is that in any group, in any family, in any work setting. You know this. There are potentially individuals who could become dictators. You know this from your own family. What prevents them from becoming a dictator is that the springboard is not in place. So my focus is on the context, and the long-term process of moving from dictatorship to democracy. Now, again, I'm going to disagree with most of the traditional models. The traditional discussion has been that there is an inevitability to this movement. Of course, from the left, we have the Marxist view that there is an inevitable movement towards the proletariat revolution, etc., etc. And one day we will get to a better world. On the right, in the last few decades, we've had this tendency to celebrate the decline of communism and to argue that there is an inevitable movement towards liberal democracy and there's some kind of end of history. I would argue that psychologically there is actually no inevitability to human change. We could become more democratic, but we could become much less democratic. Indeed, if I were to bet whether dictatorships or democracies rule by the end of the 21st century, I'd flip a coin. It's not clear that democracy is going to win out. It's not clear that the United States and Europe will remain more powerful than the dictatorships that are rising. China has already just about overtaken the United States in terms of the size of its economy, and it's building up its military very rapidly. I was in the Philippines and Japan recently. The worry in that part of the world is the expansion of China. And it's not at all clear that by the end of the century, China will not be the dominant power. So there is no inevitability about democracy winning out. It may well be that we will go backwards. So that's my assumption, that it's an open system and we have to fight to maintain democracy. It's not inevitable. Now let me come back to my starting puzzle, the puzzle of why it is so difficult to get from a dictatorship to a revolution to a democracy. Why is it that we keep having revolutions and going back to dictatorships? I believe the answer is human plasticity. Now, those of you who know something about neuroscience know that plasticity is a huge topic in neuroscience. There's actually a journal called Plasticity. And the research in neuroscience is really focused on neurons, neurotransmitters, neural networks, and how malleable the human brain is, how we can learn and relearn, etc. My argument is that we need to look outside now, not inside, and to think hard about malleability, of plasticity in human relationships. What happens when you have a revolution? In Iran, we had a revolution against the Shah. The Shah leaves. What do we need to happen next? Next, we need to change the relationship of the people with the leadership. So you need to change collective processes. You need to change leader-follower relationships. That's at a broad level. At a more minute level, we need to change interpersonal relations. Relationships within families, between husband and wife, between parents and children. We need to change relationships in contexts such as voting, where voting takes place. After the revolution, I did some very simple studies looking at how Iranians interact when it was time for elections. In the first year of the revolution, there was relative freedom in the sense that no particular group had a monopoly. There were a number of interesting elections. Now, they weren't elections in the Western sense, but there was some freedom to try to elect people who were less liberal, more liberal, etc. It wasn't completely controlled yet, and women were coming to these elections still relatively free without having to wear their hijab, etc. Now, what happened in these places? One of the first things that happened was people looked at one another, and just by looking, they could tell more or less who you're going to vote for. And what happened was most of the voting was in mosques. And there would be groups of people standing outside the mosque. And if you didn't look like the kind of person who would vote for their person, you would be given a rough time going in. Sometimes I went inside and there were people who were illiterate and they would take their paper and fill it in for them. There was discussions and debates inside the mosque about who you should vote for. In other words, the basics of what we would understand to be a free and fair election were not there. People had not yet learned what it takes. Now, unfortunately, the government wasn't interested in people learning what it takes to be in a democracy. Very quickly after that, the pressure came on. I remember an election where, like all the elections at that time, you had to have your fingerprint taken, and there was indelible ink. The next day, I did not have that ink on my finger. Well, there was a lot of pressure. People noticing, oh, you didn't vote. Well, I didn't like the candidates. I went and put ink on my finger because the pressure was so great that I had to go into certain offices to get things done, and people noticed you didn't vote. Very quickly, pressure was on to conform and obey. So when I talk about political plasticity in behavior, the same kinds of behaviors that were there during the Shah's time continued and intensified through the influence of the mullahs. The leadership didn't change. The relationship between the leadership and the followers did not change. So essentially, what we failed to do was to change fast enough in a democratic direction. And of course, this lack of change was supported by a leadership who did not want change in that direction anyway. So we had real problems. So by plasticity, I'm referring to change. I'm referring to change not just individually but collectively. And it's not just relevant, of course, to Iran. It's certainly relevant to the United States at the moment. If we look at patterns of voting, patterns of support for candidates, and what's going on with deprived people who feel they've been shut out, and their perceptions of how Donald Trump is going to save them. You can see this lack of plasticity there. Now, we have mechanisms for bringing about change. This is now the second page. We have mechanisms. We know that through schools, through families, through community centers, through the media, we can bring about change. But the question is, toward what goal? What is our goal? I've tried to work out some of these goals, at least psychologically, and I've tried to represent them in this circle. What do we have to teach the citizen so that the citizen is capable of participating, of engaging in a democratic process? Well, this is the ideal I set out. I think in academia, one of the things we can do is to be idealistic. The first thing is having the ability to say, I could be wrong, and to feel that I could be wrong. Obviously, if I am a fanatical religious person, that's very difficult. If I am a fanatical political person, that's very difficult. But to get beyond that fanaticism and to be able to say, I could be wrong as a starting point. Then the next two, I must critically question even the sacred beliefs of my own society. Well, that's very difficult to do. It's easy to say. There is a huge literature, research literature on ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is the tendency to think that my way of doing things is the right way. How do you cook rice?
In a microwave.
Oh, in a microwave. That's obviously wrong. God. That's not even a start. You know, psychologists have done a lot of work on ethnocentrism. But I still think the best work on this is by Jonathan Swift in Gulliver's Travels, where he describes the war going on for generations between these little people, groups of little people, and they ask him, could you come and help us defeat our enemy? And he says, well, okay, I'll help you, but tell me first, why are you killing each other? And of course, he's expecting this enormously important reason. And they say, well, it starts with the little Indians versus the big Indians. He says, what do you mean, little Indians? Well, some of us break our eggs at the little end, and that other group, they are heretics. They insist on breaking their boiled eggs at the big end. And of course, we're right. Ethnocentrism is a global phenomenon. It's not unique to any one group. Getting beyond ethnocentrism is very difficult. But you're still wrong with your rice. I must revise my opinion based on evidence. When the evidence comes in, I have to change my mind. I have to change my opinion. We can see this in global warming debates right now. Global warming is a hoax put out by China. You can see this is very difficult to bring about, even in open societies. The next two are about interacting with others. Understanding that those who are different from me can still teach me things of value. Being open to that. And again, this is very easy to say, but difficult to do. There is a human tendency towards similarity attraction. It works at the interpersonal level. It works at the intergroup level. I did a study up in Canada, the heart of multiculturalism, an open society where they love each other. We did a study with 6 different ethnic groups, and we looked at how similar these groups see themselves to be to other groups and how much they want to interact with the other groups. Are you willing to live next door to that other group? Are you willing for that other group to marry into your family? What did we find? We found that these ethnic groups, the more they saw the other group as dissimilar, the less they wanted to have to do with them. Similarity is a big factor. Teaching people to interact and learn from dissimilar others is a huge challenge. It's not just in the third world, it's in North America and Europe as well. The next 2 are about experiences and seeking information from different sources, understanding that we have to be open to new experiences, and being willing to open up and teach others, giving them new experiences. Now, these are all things that we can talk about, and they're very easy to discuss, especially in a university setting. But in practice, they're very difficult to implement. And what I'm suggesting is that they're an ideal that in terms of personality development, in terms of cognitive style, we need to think about in the long term in order to have a fully vibrant democracy. Now, there's one big problem with all of this that I've said. It could lead us to take a very relativistic perspective. If I'm going to be open to you and you to me, and we're going to be all seeking information and willing to change, and it sounds as if there are no principles. So the last 2 I put here, there are principles of right and wrong. That's very important. And the principles of right and wrong don't just come out of law books right now. I believe there is an evolutionary basis for morality. If you look at research on animals, it's pretty clear. Fairness is not unique to humans. There's a wonderful study. The title is something like, "Monkeys Reject Unequal Pay." It's a very simple study. You get a monkey in cage 1, monkey in cage 2, you put them next to each other, you teach them to carry out a task, you give them equal rewards. The pay is the same. They can see that the other monkey is getting the same pay. Then you give one of the monkeys a lesser pay. What does that monkey do? Throws a tantrum. There's lots of research showing that animals, at some basic level, understand fairness. I've researched human rights and duties from this perspective, that our understanding of rights and duties actually emerge from very primitive behaviors. Example, turn-taking. Turn-taking is present in animals. It's basic to human behavior. Human communications depends on turn-taking. Turn-taking is learned by infants very early. If you look at mother-infant interaction, turn-taking takes place very quickly. Turn-taking is used by us as a basis for our justice system. And if you listen to little children playing in the playground, one of the first things you hear is, "That's not fair, he took my turn." Kids understand turn-taking. There is an evolutionary basis to it, and later on we learn to use the terminology of rights and duties in relation to turn-taking. So in the law courts, we have the prosecution taking a turn, then the defense taking a turn. In politics, we have term limits which enforce some kind of turn-taking. So there is an evolutionary basis to our morality, and there are principles of right and wrong. It's not all random. Some experiences, finally, some experiences are of value more than others. So it's not that I'm open to your experiences and you're open to mine in some kind of haphazard way. There are principles that say some experiences are better than others. So I believe what we should be doing is investing at a very basic level in training citizens to participate in fuller democracies, including in the United States, including in Europe, where the arrival of millions of refugees has created new tensions and is testing the democracies there. I want to end by focusing on the role of psychology. In the end, democracy is an idea. It has to be practiced. It has to be carried out by human beings. And it will depend on the capacity for us to relate to one another in a democratic way. That's what it will depend on. And unfortunately, what happens in revolutions is that we manage to overthrow regimes and smash down statues, but we do not manage to quickly enough change ourselves and our relationships. And that's where we failed in Iran. That's where we have failed in other revolutions, to move fast enough so that the next dictator doesn't have the opportunity to spring to power. I'll end there for discussion. Thank you.
Well, I want to mention that the springboard that brought these revolutions about were each time an external factor came in. In the French Revolution, the monarchies came in to restore the monarchy in France. In Russia, the other nations, the Western nations, came in to throw out Lenin. In Cuba, we came in to try to get rid of Castro 7 times or 6 times they tried to assassinate him. And as I understand it, in Iran, things were okay, I've read, until Rockefeller got the Shah admitted to the United States, which they said so enraged the Iranians that they felt that the outside world was cheating them, and they became enemies of the outside worlds. So psychology, as you say, is the big deal here, but it so happens that every time somebody has a revolution, the other outsiders don't want it.
Well, certainly, world powers are always intervening in the affairs of smaller countries. There's no doubt about that. However, the argument I'm making is that in order to move from one type of regime to another, for example, in order to move from a dictatorship that could be a monarchy or some other kind of dictatorship to a more open democratic society, even if there were no external factors, what you need to have is a citizenship that has changed and that can sustain the new system. Imagine us in this room. We could decide in an hour what the Constitution will be to govern ourselves in this room. We could write that Constitution. Now, Do we have the psychological makeup to actually make that constitution work? That's the question. Are we capable of governing according to that constitution? Well, it depends what the constitution is. If it's very different from what we've ever known, then it's going to be very difficult to implement. And that's what you have in revolutions. Typically, people sit around and write a constitution, and then to implement the constitution becomes difficult. Of course, in the case of Iran, the constitution that we have is fatally flawed anyway. So that's another problem.
What is the role of polarization like it happened in Egypt after the Arab Spring? They had one group of people that were Islamist, another group of people democracy seekers, and the two couldn't come together. As a result, only the numbers spoke, and the regime that came to power ultimately caused its own demise.
Yes, very good point about polarization. You've actually jumped ahead to my next book. Oh, yes. He's asking, what is the role of polarization? I'm actually writing on mutual radicalization of one another. It is a huge problem in revolutions. When a dictatorship is toppled, typically what you've had to do in order to topple that dictatorship is to coordinate a vast range of interests, which is what happened in Iran, which is what happened in Russia in 1917. So you have these different political interests coordinating to topple the regime. Then after that collapse, they start fighting. They start competing. And of course, the most ruthless typically survive. I mean, what was it that allowed the fundamentalists in Iran to survive? Well, go back to Darwin. It's reproduction and extermination of the other, if you like. They reproduced faster than anybody else. And certainly polarization does take place, but in order for change towards democracy to take place, what you need to happen is that those groups need to have the cognitive ability and the social skills to start negotiating and including one another. Whereas what happens typically after an anti-dictatorship revolution is quite the opposite of that. The most ruthless group comes out on top because they're the ones willing to kill fastest and the most.
The reason societies don't move from a dictatorship to democracy is because the plasticity doesn't happen. As we know in psychology, plasticity is not something that happens overnight. Mm-hmm. Plasticity requires learning something, accepting it, and then doing it repeatedly.
Yeah.
And for that to happen, you need time.
Yes.
In a society that has never had a chance to practice, and plasticity comes from outside. Yes. It comes from you experiencing something from outside that starts having an effect for you. It's not an indigenous system. It's not something that you start plasticizing your mind. Mm-hmm. So for that to happen, the society needs a good long time.
Yes.
To practice. And under dictatorship, you have never had that opportunity to practice. So inevitably, when you go from dictatorship, you know what you don't want, but you don't know what you want. Mm-hmm. That's the biggest problem of every revolution. Mm-hmm. Because you have never had, because you have experienced every day what you don't want.
Yes.
But you have never had the opportunity to know what it is that you want.
Yes.
So really to understand these causes and see how we move from one to the other, it's not going to solve the problem. It's good, it's interesting, mm-hmm. but it doesn't solve any problems. And maybe the reason that in South Africa and the United States the revolution took a different way is not because these people were more skillful mm-hmm. in their human relationship, Maybe it was because it was a war against occupation more than an internal strife that had been there for hundreds of years. And these people came from a lot of different backgrounds. In South Africa, you can have a completely different set of circumstances. So to me, it's important to know really what changes, what do we need to do in dictatorial regimes to bring about that plasticity before the eruption starts.
Well, I certainly agree with you about the long term. I start the book, The Psychology of Dictatorship, with Athens. And I stress that movement towards actualized democracy is thousands of years. It's certainly not decades. And I start the quote with the quote from John Adams, the second president, saying, all democracies commit suicide. If you go back to Athens 2,500 years ago or so, they had a sort of democracy, very limited. Free men could participate and vote. But of course, it was much fuller participation than we know today. Free men in Athens had to participate by taking responsibility directly. They would come to you and say, okay, this year you're in the committee for taxes at the port. You're in the committee for... You couldn't say, no, I don't have time. You had to participate. Now, Athens, of course, failed. Then we had to wait for quite a long time before we had the next set of changes towards democracy. But we have to remember that it's taken a long time. American democracy started with the vote for free men who were very rich. In England, when they started having the vote for men, it was for rich men. And in 1832, the Reform Act that came in still basically gave the vote to men who were propertied. It wasn't until the 20th century that men without property actually got the vote. And then gradually women got the vote. And it wasn't until the 1960s that minorities could vote in the United States. So what we call democracy today, even this limited form of democracy, is very recent. And we have to look back at least 2,500 years to understand the process. But what I'm saying is that the next phase is not inevitable. It's not inevitable that we move forward. We may move backward, but in order to make sure we go forward, there are certain things that we need to bring about. And that one of them is the socialization of democratic citizens. And these are some of the characteristics I believe democratic citizens need to have. Of course, it's easy to discuss this in a university setting. It's much more difficult to discuss it in a setting in rural Iowa.
Do you think that democracy is always and at all times the best system? I'm thinking, for instance, about Singapore under, I would say, a smart dictator, somewhat benevolent dictator, Lee Kuan Yew. You could see that in just one generation, Singapore went from being dirt poor to become very rich. Another example could be Taiwan.
Yes.
And maybe these countries are more ready now for real democracy, but you could argue that 50 years ago, if they had started on the democracy path like India, for instance, they would never have achieved what they achieved today.
A very good question. If we go back to the Romans actually believed, even during their more democratic times, they had in their constitution a clause that said, in times of trouble, we will hand power to a dictator. The term dictator actually is origin with the Romans. They used a dictator, and it would be for something like 6 months. Of course, the problem was that they found, once you hand power over to the dictator, you can't get it back. That, you know. But this argument that during certain periods of national development, it is better to have a dictator, that's an interesting argument. I would argue that it is not the best system if the administration of society is fairly efficient. And that's a big if. But I accept that some dictators, Peter the Great, I think he did some good in Russia. There are some dictators who bring about changes that are for reform. There's no doubt about that.
You mentioned that the most, in Iran revolution, the most ruthless won the revolution. Do you think it was because of that only, or it was because it was they were more familiar, or masses were more familiar with what they were saying, or yes, they had deeper root in the masses? And one more, and I have another question that yes, from what you said just now, that do you think Reza Shah was an example of a dictatorship that helped the society?
Mm-hmm. Well, the first question about the regime of the mullahs being closer to the people, we have to remember there were factions within the mullahs. The question is, why did this particular faction win out? Because there were factions who were much more liberal, much more tolerant, and they were wiped out, basically. And it continues. Look at the Green Revolution and what happened. With respect to Reza Shah, you know, I'm sure that he did some good. The problem is that the Shah's regime created the conditions for the mullahs to take over. So it's rather like saying, you know, what happened in feudalism, you know, created the conditions for capitalism. So we wouldn't have had one without the other, it seems to me.
Thank you so much for a very interesting subject that you raised. For many years, I have thought about Iranian mentalities, and I want to ask your opinion or your advice. If you could give advice to Iranian study all over in the universities, how we can fight against Iranian ethnic too much pride, because I have realized that, for instance, you can criticize Israelis or even generals, the American general, and you will be treated well after criticizing them. But with Iranian, you cannot criticize anything because still they are very proud of 2,500 years of civilization and this and that. And I personally take an approach by insulting them, but I don't know insulting Iranian because I feel that maybe they need a shock a little bit, that someone shocked them, even if I am not so agree myself, so extreme, but I go to extreme to exercise that. I don't know if I'm doing right thing or not, and what is your suggestion generally for breaking this too much narrow-mindedness?
Okay, well, are you telling me I'm wrong to tell him that his rice is lousy? I mean, that's an excellent question. I think there are people here who are more qualified to answer it than I am. Of course, I never get insulted or shocked, so... but I would be happy to discuss it afterwards. I think there are people here who are better qualified than me.
You were talking about revolution, and I think oppression starts leading to revolution. Like in Iran, we were so fed up with the monarchy, the Shah, X, Y, and Z, that we were consumed psychologically for a change. And we invested zero amounts Change to what? We never thought about democracy. We shouted democracy, but we wanted the Shah. We never thought about what are the infrastructure, what are the education. And it takes time. I don't think we were ready for democracy. Now, when you talk about India, you talk about South Africa, you talk about here in US, the fact that those leaders were astute enough to know that they have to educate the public. The Americans at the time, I'm sure they weren't educated to understand even voting. Mm-hmm. But the leaders were willing to give the time and infrastructure to the society to learn what democracy is all about. I think those are some of the elements that we never had in Iran.
Yes. Well, I think you're right about the elements. I think timing and luck are also factors. For example, I think the United States was extremely lucky to have had George Washington because he was offered the opportunity to be king. He refused. He set the tradition of term limits. Mandela was the same. The idea that he could easily have continued to rule. There is actually research in psychology on the old adage that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. There's good experimental evidence that most people, if they have absolute power, they become corrupted. Now, not everybody, not us. Those other people. But certainly, Mandela and Washington, I think they are exceptional. They are exceptional.
Gandhi was there. Gandhi did almost the same. You know?
Well, okay, but he didn't have the power.
Right.
He didn't have the power. But however, I agree with you about the time factor. We need time, and that's a big part of this process.
Very promising in terms of history suggestion that certain good behavior, democratic behavior, is evolutionary selected. Are there bad behaviors that are also evolutionary elected? Should be worried about evolution in terms of the rise of despotism, or is evolution in our favor?
Oh. Well, is evolution in our favor? I think there are some characteristics that we have that are certainly in our favor, and I would say point to basic things like empathy and fairness and those things that are inbuilt in. However, aggressivity is a big factor. You know, I have to mention Freud because I once set myself the task of reading everything he'd ever written, and it took me about 6 months of spending hours every day, and at the end of it I thought, gosh, what a lot of garbage, you know. I mean, 99% of it was so bad, but the 1% he gets right is brilliant. I think he's the only genius we've had in psychology. I hope there aren't any psychologists around. But it's true. He gets that one thing right, and it's about his discussions on war. The fact that we humans continually go to war, we are aggressive, and our aggressivity is a big danger. Now, there are those who have argued that aggression and warfare and killing has declined in recent years, and they've given statistics. I think that's persuasive. However, when we look at violence, there are actually different types of violence. One is direct violence. One is structural violence. Another is cultural violence. And I believe that structural and cultural violence have actually increased. Now, why has direct violence declined? in large part because of medicine. If it hadn't been for modern medicine, the number of Americans killed in Iraq and Afghanistan would be huge. But now we can patch people together and keep them alive and say, well, no, look at the statistics. Only so many people have died in this war. Whereas in Vietnam, we didn't have that capability up to that point.
It seems obvious to me that if there is ever a single government on earth, a single sovereignty with control of violence, you know, a one world government, it's going to be a dictatorship. But maybe I'm wrong. Do you think there's any possibility that a one world government could be an actual functioning democracy?
One of my disappointments, his question was, can a one world government be a democracy? He believes it's more likely to be a dictatorship. That's a complicated question. As we globalize, there is this integration going on, and there is language death. As every month several languages die, the prominence of English and some other languages increases. Over the last 500 years, something like 9,000 languages have died. Only about 6,000 are left. So you could argue we're becoming one world with fewer languages, fewer differences, and we're going to end up with one government. But there's a counter-argument that just as we globalize, there is more efforts to break away. There's Brexit. There's attempts to create Quebec independence, all these separatist movements. I'm not sure that we're going to end up with one global government. It would be interesting to think about it. How would it work? Our governments so far have resisted using modern technologies to allow ordinary people to participate in decision-making. We could have much greater participation in decision-making through modern technology. We have the technology, but the governments are not interested. So how would it work at the global level with 7 billion people? Well, I don't think that the authorities, if they're in the shape of authorities we have now, are interested in the people participating. If they were, we would have much greater decision-making by people.
Really, what a loaded topic. I've been thinking about quite a few things as you've been speaking, but one thing that you've left out of the chart here, which seems just absolutely undeniably apparent, is the circumstance and the situation. For example, you brought up the idea that if we were in this room, we decided to adopt some sort of manifesto, how are we going to conduct ourselves? In this setting, able to leave the classroom, et cetera, and go out into the world from here. But if for some reason this classroom happened to break away from the world and we were traveling through outer space, I think we could come to some sort of arrangement where we'd vote, we'd have an interest. Mm-hmm. So obviously the importance of situationalism. So secondly, I think the American experiment in terms of this democracy, which I've never really thought of, but was so incredible in so much as it was somewhat of a fresh start. And the monarch wasn't here in North America, it was overseas. And I wonder how this would have played out differently if the monarchy happened to be here in North America. And one of the things, so in Iran, when you don't have trust, I imagine with the Shah and whatnot, I imagine they had secret police and all this, and the citizens just naturally distrusted one another. So even if the Shah gets removed and you don't trust your neighbor, this plasticity, all this sort of stuff, if you don't actually have trust in your fellow citizen, how are you supposed to bring all this stuff together? And the other point was a question, was social media in modern day, if you were to recreate society, it seems like the children, the youth really rule social media more or less. And So what consequences, I'll try to pose a question, what consequences do you think social media would play in the modern era in terms of the establishment of a democracy and the dangers of, as you label them, personalities, like Trump and Hillary are both, and people, and individuals that within that setting only voting for their own self-interest rather than the interest of the entire group?
Okay, well, I'll try to extract a question from what you've said. We have to remember that young people are always different in the sense that their voting participation is always lower. They may be very active on social media and they may go out and demonstrate, but actually, if you look at voting patterns, if you're younger, blacker, poorer, you're less likely to vote. That's what the statistics tell us. Now, will younger people make a bigger difference through social media? I don't think politically, no. Occupy Wall Street was interesting, but actually politically, they didn't manage to push Sanders as far as the Tea Party has managed to push Trump. So I'm skeptical that younger people will make the difference as things stand.
So this is partly in counterpoint to the first question that came up. You've created a model of these 10 characteristics, which look very interesting, and skills that need to be developed in order to enable a democracy. But you also used the term that we need to teach these skills. And as one of the previous questions asked, who is going to teach those skills? When you say we, who does we refer to? And are you saying that there is an obligation on the part of democracies to teach other countries about democracy? And if so, then how do you avoid this feeling of us forcing a system on others that don't want it?
Great question. Well, first of all, in order to export democracy, we have to have something to export. So I would argue we don't have full democracy here to export. What we need to first of all do is to have a full democracy in the United States.
I think that we are about as far as anybody is going to get, so to require that idealism is an unachievable goal.
Well, that's where we disagree. I think that, that if you look at the education system, we are doing a fantastic job at the elites level. So at Stanford, everything is fine. But, I mean, I've taught in Canada. I used to be at McGill. I've taught in Europe. One of the things I notice about the American system is that in Canada, while I was at McGill, McGill is sort of top of the heap in Canada. If you went from McGill to other universities, there was very little difference. It wasn't that big a difference. If you go from the top British universities to the next layers, they're all pretty similar. Why? Because we use external examiners there. While I was a student in England, none of my professors examined me. I was always examined by professors from other universities. Now, in the United States, if you go from Stanford to the ranking at 1,230, there's 4,000 institutions. There's a huge leap. And if you go to high schools here, you have enormous variation. So when I say we have a duty, I mean the people who are influential in the education system particularly, and in government, we have to invest in education. We have to invest in civic education, and it's not being done at the moment. It's not being done at the schools that matter. And I don't mean Stanford, I mean the schools that are for the majority, for the poor. I mean schools where when you go to the PTA meeting, there's 2 people and a cat. So we have to think about the majority, not the elite.
Thank you for your time. I've been thinking about my question, I would say around 6 months. And I've been studying about it a lot. It might be a really interesting question for you as well. I don't really want to name any society, but in a certain society, government give right to citizen to carry gun. Do you think that subject would be kind of avoiding dictatorship or maintaining the democracy because the next government knows people got something they can,
Right. Well, I mean, that's the argument for human rights, that you're going to be able to resist government dictatorship, etc.
I know it's a little bit complicated question to ask.
Right. No, I understand the argument. And, I listened to enough of Charlton Heston's speeches when he was leader. And, I can understand people making that argument. But then we have to think about the costs. And the costs are enormous in terms of the tens of thousands of people killed, particularly in poor neighborhoods. So it's a double-edged sword. I believe that the best defense against government tyranny is an educated citizenship rather than the guns. So,
Do you think that would be considered as a psychological method to maintain the democracy in a certain societies? I mean, let me rephrase myself. Do you think if Iranian had, Iranian human or Iranian citizen had, I don't know, like gun rights in 35 years ago?
Right, you mean if ordinary people in Iran were armed, they could resist more? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, yeah, right.
Well, right. I mean, I guess if you had that kind of, counter army, you could certainly fight. Right. I mean, that's another problem. But certainly, I have heard that argument before. I have heard that argument that. Yes. Sorry. She's ruling right now. She's the dictator.
I was wondering what your opinion is about countries like England that are have a very robust government, prime minister, parliament, but the monarchy and the queen and everything is still intact, and they appear not to interfere so much with the government, but they're still there. And what is the logic behind it?
Right.
As far as you?
Well, I don't worry about the royal family in England. I worry more about Rupert Murdoch and people like that. It's a fascinating trend that if you look back over the last 4 or 5 prime ministers, one of the first people they've met when they've come to power, often secretly, and we've found out decades later, is Rupert Murdoch. And Theresa May has just had a meeting with him. Why am I concerned about that? Because this is another example of individuals who happen to be incredibly rich, have all that wealth, who are anti-union, anti-increasing wage, all the things that the working class need, and there is somebody who is much more powerful than the Queen, able to access the Prime Minister very quickly after she comes to power. So I do think that places like England are extremely unequal still. If you look at social mobility, the probability of a poor person, a child born in a poor family, rising to even middle or upper middle class, that has actually stagnated and declined. We're not doing well in terms of social mobility, but we keep this myth about the American dream and how things are open and as long as you work hard, you can get there. Well, it's not true. The statistics tell us it's not true. It's true for a minority of people. And at the same time, we have this enormous wealth concentration. And it's not income. Remember, it's people like me, the middle class, who rely on income. The rich rely on wealth. And wealth concentration has accumulated dramatically over the last 30 years. Piketty's book, Atkinson's written a wonderful book on this. The documentation is very strong that wealth concentration is exaggerated now, it's increasing, so that fewer and fewer hands hold the real wealth in the world, and it's global. So this is a big challenge with globalization. And when Trump says, I'm going to bring the jobs back to America, all this stuff, well, you know, capital will flow to the cheapest labor. And his capital has certainly flowed to the cheapest labor. You know, his life is representing exactly that. So I'm not worried about the Queen, I'm worried about the others.
Thank you for an amazing evening. I would like to ask you, would you comment about democracy in Ukraine? Ukraine went to rough times right now. It's been independent for 25 years. I've been in Ukraine during the Orange Revolution. Recently, we experienced another revolution. And yes, now we have a lot of sources, a lot of information how you should build the democracy,
yes,
how you should maintain it. But unfortunately, after each revolution, my country is still facing a lot of problems.
Yes, yes. Well, as somebody over there mentioned, this is an example of external forces. And I mentioned earlier in my talk that one of the dangers we have is that we have major dictatorships not just trying to preserve their own power, but actively trying to prevent democracy in other places. Unlike Mr. Trump, I don't admire Putin. I think he is a force for bad things in the world at the moment. And I think that I wish the West had been more forceful in that part of the world and helped democracy grow stronger. This is something that's going to be very difficult. And it's part of the story of how what we thought was going to be democratic movement forward and endless expansion of democracy, we thought that was going to happen, but now it's retrenchment. Now we're going backwards. And even China, 10 years ago, I was in China and it looked promising. Things were going forward, but now it seems to me, if you look at the last 5 years, we've gone backwards in China. So this is a problem globally. And I very much hope Ukraine comes through with bigger hope.
On that happy note.
Okay.
Thank you very, very much.
My pleasure.